Welcome to the Practice You podcast. My name is Elena Brower. Together, we'll explore and enjoy content and conversations around mastering transitions in our relations, our wellness, our careers, our families, and especially in our missions and visions. You are invited to learn and love and listen with me. Welcome to Practice You. Welcome back to the podcast. I have one of my first inspirations, one of my first teachers, one of my first guides, one of the first people that even gave me the remotest possibility that I would eventually teach yoga. Her name is Seane Corn. Welcome, Seane.
Thank you so much. I didn't realize that. I'm humbled.
It's true. Back in the day, in the late 90s, when I would leverage my credit cards, travel to LA and take class at YogaWorks on Montana, you were one of the first teachers with whom I studied. You blew my mind. You were like cursing and having fun and being super irreverent, but also like deeply, deeply reverent at the same time.
That's funny.
You blew my mind. You're an internationally acclaimed yoga teacher. You are a spiritual and social activist. You're one of the first teachers in the US to popularize Vinyasa flow yoga. And you started in the 80s, correct?
I started practicing in the 80s, yeah.
Okay. When did you start teaching, actually?
1994 is when I taught my first class.
Dude, I caught you like 4 years in. That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
You're known for your impassioned teaching style. We all know this who studied with you. You're the co-founder of Off the Mat Into the World that started in 2007. And all told, since then, you've helped to raise over $3.5 million via the Global Save a Challenge by activating communities of yoga and wellness. You are training yoga leaders. Note, I didn't say teachers. Yoga leaders worldwide on how to activate real social change. You're raising awareness about global humanitarian issues such as HIV and AIDS pandemic, sex trafficking. You also created a few other things. The yoga program at Children of the Night, which is a shelter that houses and educates adolescent prostitutes. God bless you. You were named in 2005 the National Yoga Ambassador for Youth AIDS. In 2013, you received the Global Green International Environmental Leadership Award and the Humanitarian Award by the Smithsonian Institute. Come on, girl. But your book, Revolution of the Soul, is what we're here to talk about. And it was released just last year, published by Sounds True. We share a publisher. And in light of the fact that Ram Dass has just passed away, we're now talking just a few days or a week after he's passed. I know that he was a teacher for you. How do you see your role, to start with, as sort of a senior teacher, an elder now in the yoga community?
I think that's a great question because it's something that I started pondering when I was around 48 years old, I would say. I'm 53 now. So I'd say about 5 years ago, as I was approaching 50, I became really aware that organically my role within the communities of yoga was naturally going to begin to evolve. Like I'm no longer the ingenue. That ship sailed many, many years ago. And yet I also didn't consider myself a senior teacher. I hadn't taken that ownership yet, but I had a couple of moments where some senior teachers, and I put this in air quotes, initiated me, like kind of passed the baton. And I, at the time I was kind of like, what? I'm too young for this. And then I started realizing, no, my senior teachers are retiring. And with the loss of Matzi and Ram Dass and many other teachers, they're dying. And there's a responsibility that someone like me has, who has longevity in his community and has seen it evolve and grow, to step into another level and take real ownership for it. So when I was 48, as I was approaching my 50th birthday, I started to do some really deep inner work and started to cultivate teachers and therapists around me, older women, to, I guess, usher me in
Yeah.
to a new level of understanding, whether it was about what was going to be happening to me physiologically, psychologically, emotionally, what needed to die for something to be reborn, what level of confidence did I have to have within myself in order to take ownership of this role and be okay with the authority that comes with being an elder, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And in that process of working with these older women, the reflection I kept getting back from them is they kept saying, Seane, you need to write a book. You need to write a book. And at the time, I thought that that suggestion was more about credibility, meaning that, well, if you're going to be an elder in the community, you have to have a certain amount of credibility, and having a book really allows for that. At least it's, from the outside. So I had a lot of resistance to that because of my own limiting beliefs that I'm not smart enough, I'm not organized enough, I don't have enough content, I don't have enough lived experience, all that
Mm-hmm.
stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I committed to going into that process. Now that I'm on the other side of it, and even during the writing of it, I realized that it was never about the completion of the book. It was never about the book itself. It was about the process that I was going to have to be forced to go in to confront these limiting beliefs and to have to really address some of the deeper shadows and also rebirth the youngest part of myself, the child part of myself that had been dormant for a really long time. And in the excavating of that child self, I also had to excavate a lot of my trauma. And it was through having to be present to that trauma in a different way that I really healed, confronted my limiting beliefs, um, reframed some of the narratives that I had, some of the stories that I hadn't been willing to go towards because, quite frankly, my role as a teacher and the identity that that role affords lets me bypass some of those stories, meaning that I can tell you how I feel without actually having to feel anything.
Yeah.
I can assign a lot of depth and meaning to experiences without actually having to be present to it. And writing the book forced me to have to be present. And it opened up this incredible threshold of spiritual maturation that couldn't have happened unless I walked through the messiness of that process. And so, in answer to your question, like, I feel way more prepared now to step into that role as mentor, as leader, with a lot more clarity and confidence. And it was because of the process of writing that book
Right.
that I feel that I now have that willingness to do so in a way that prior I didn't have. It was a real initiation.
Yeah. That is a true story about writing. In the first chapter of your book, you tell a story about your friend Billy. I'm on page 16. Over the years, you say, I've sat at the feet of saints and sages. I've traveled to meet beloved teachers and guides, but never have I awakened to the sweet and simple truth of seeing the God within the way that I did that night through the eyes of an angel, my angel, in a place called heaven. Hilarious. Heaven was the name of the club, by the way, that you were in. I remember it.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like to share that story? Because I think it actually tells a lot about you and who you've become.
Well, that story is it. It was really it's how in some ways, how I launched the book, because I've been telling the story of Billy for many, many years because of the deep influence that that teaching had on the way in which I show up in the world. That, like you had said earlier, I straddle that line between irreverence and being very reverent, very seeing the holy and the sacred in all things, and also kind of being in on the joke at the same time.
Right.
And I had a real resistance to religion. It wasn't the way I wasn't raised with religion. I had a lot of fear and superstition around it. I didn't understand the difference between religion and spirituality. And when I moved to New York from Jersey, right after high school, so I was still 17, I worked in nightclubs because I didn't have an education, and um, I was open, and I also partied really, really hard at that time. So working in nightclubs was a way to get a lot of my needs met. I got the free drugs and alcohol, and I also got to experience really the shadow side of life and dance at that edge. So I worked at an all-male gay sex club. It was in the rectory of Limelight, which was a very famous nightclub in a church,
Right.
and Heaven was a private club. I worked there behind the bar, and Billy was a man who came into the bar most nights, and African-American man, gay. Billy, though, was he he had grown up in Ohio and had been ostracized from his church and his community when he came out and came to live in New York, just to be able to be in his truth. There was a lot of melancholy about Billy, but he was also open and joyous and loved me, and would give me a very hard time about my drug use. We became very close friends. And what I write about in the book is a singular event that happened that really shifted the trajectory of my life, although I couldn't have known it at that time. And that's why I talk about angels showing up in very peculiar ways
Right.
to help to launch you into your destiny.
Hmm.
And Billy was that for me. And what had happened is he came into the club. I hadn't seen him in a while. He looked very frail. And when I went to hug him, I noticed open sores on his neck and shoulders. And when I asked what it was, he told me they were symptomatic of his disease, which, of course, back in the
AIDS.
late 80s, it was AIDS. And my reaction to hearing that word and to being such close proximity to the symptoms of it, I recoiled and felt deeply ashamed for my reaction and apologized. And so Billy asked me if I wanted to understand more about his disease. And of course I did. And he explained it to me. And I asked him at the end of the conversation what was going to happen. Now, of course, at that time there was no cure. There's no cure today. And I knew the answer, but I guess I was hoping for a different, response. And he looked me square in the eye and told me he was dying. And I asked him if he was afraid, and he told me no, because of his faith in God. And when he said, my faith in God, I recoiled again. But this time Billy started laughing. And he said, Seane, don't you believe in God? And I told him I didn't. And I explained why. And he listened, and he had so much compassion, and said, I get it. That's how it was for me too. And then he said, Seane, would you like to see God right now? And I remember looking around the club, and I was like, now, here? There's men dancing naked. They're making out. It's like the last place that you would think that God would inhabit. And so I said, yeah, you show me God here. And so Billy started to point to different people in the club. Danny the Wonder Pony, some white guy that used to come into the club and with a saddle on his back
Wow.
and chaps, and he was naked. And for $1, you can climb on his back and hit him with a switch. And Billy points to this person and says, God's right there. And then he points to Violet, who was known then. We would have referred to Violet then as a cross-dresser.
Right.
But now we understand Violet to be transgender. And Billy pointed to Violet and said, God's right there. And then pointed to two guys that were like dressed. They look like Wall Street dudes, and arguing over a pitcher of beer.
Right.
And Billy said, God's right there. And then Billy took his hand and he put it on my heart, or put it on his heart. He took his hand, put it on my heart, mine on his, and then said, Seane, God's right here. He said, I'm going to tell you something, and I hope you remember this the whole of your life. He said, ignore the story and see the soul, and remember to love. You'll never regret it. And those two sentences shifted something in me, because he continued then to say, he said, all of this, it's just a story. It's not who we are. He said, Danny the Wonder Pony, Violet, me, you, AIDS, all of it. It's an aspect of our journey, but it's not who we are. Who we are love and light and infinite grace. And we are all here to awaken to the power of love within. Everything else is just lessons to learn and karma to burn and opportunities for this spiritual maturation. None of it's bad, because he wanted me to understand that all of us in time, in a timeline that's between each soul and the God of their own understanding, is what's going to lead to understanding love. So all moments are holy, all beings are sacred. Yeah. And obviously I'm paraphrasing what he said, but in essence, he was helping me to understand that God is not just in the light. it's in the grit, it's in the grotesque, it's in the heartbreak, it's in the loss. And only when we stand in judgment to that which we don't understand is when we're showing evidence of where God is missing within our own perception. And that shifted something huge for me, because it helped me to understand that it's all a story, and that our work is to not put too much value in the narrative itself, but to look at the individual soul with deep empathy and appreciation, because as Ram Dass says, we're all just walking each other home.
Right. I want to skip around a little bit in the book, even though my notes are chronological, but I want to skip around. Chapter 7, just to like open and close this book. You speak about your experiences with Batabi Joyce. You talked with Shannon Algeo on his podcast too. And you mentioned the role of therapy in helping you learn all the coping mechanisms that you have now for dealing with potentially re-traumatizing situations. And you talked about, like, I hadn't read any personal recountings, but on page 121, you talk about the particular moment where you were able to finally say to Patabi Joyce, stop. Like, don't touch me like that. That is not okay for me. So many women never took that chance. That we all had that chance, but so many didn't take that chance. Do you feel like talking about that at all? Because I feel like that's something that people should hear and know.
Yeah, of course. Writing that chapter was very, very hard for me. I've been talking about Patabi, amongst my circle for years and years. And if someone cared to ask, it was like, yeah, absolutely, that happened, and that's the truth. But to write it in a book and to have to go into the details of it felt very intimidating. And I skirted around. Here I am writing a whole chapter about, finding the God within, and also, or finding the guru within, and also talking about the hypocrisy of the guru, or the danger of the guru disciple relationship and why. And yet I'm avoiding the story itself. And there was a moment where I wrote in the chapter about how this kind of behavior exists today, this imbalance of power. And unless we speak out about it, then we are complicit to that particular danger and a part of the problem. And all of a sudden I realized, like, son of a bitch, like, I'm complicit because I refuse to be specific. And I remember all the women coming forward over the last few years, women that I don't necessarily know, but they were writing blogs and getting thrashed online, and mostly by other men. And I would read what they were saying, and I'd think to myself, they're not lying. I was there. That's exactly what went down.
Yeah.
But these women lost their jobs. These women were vilified. These women were ostracized from their communities.
Wow.
They were called liars. They were told that the world is an illusion, and you project onto the world that which is within yourself. And I realized that as I processed my resistance to writing the story, I knew it was because I didn't want to hurt, or it wasn't so much hurting. I didn't want to be ostracized by some of the mentors in my life who I love, who are very protective of the legacy of Patabi Joyce. But what I also knew is I'm not going to lose my job. In the big picture, it's not going to impact my reputation negatively. I might lose a couple of friends.
Even if it does, who cares? It's the truth.
Right. But I had to process that.
Right.
Like, I had to really let myself, really ask myself, what's my concern here? And feel into that. And I thought, I have a responsibility. This is really, again, first step in modeling mentorship and leadership. I have a responsibility because of my positionality within the yoga community, above and beyond anything else, that this is the privilege, because of the privilege that I've been given, that there also is a responsibility with that. And I have to do it so that some young teacher never has to do that again.
Right.
So that they never have to be put in a position to be called a liar. Like, I'd rather take that on the chin because my positionality can afford that hit. someone else might not be able to afford losing their job. So how dare I not take so I lose a relationship, but how dare the injustice of that really weighed on my body.
Right.
And so I was like, oh, I am writing this and I'm going to be specific. But it was not easy. I had to balance that within my own, the trauma within myself of having to go into it to tell the story from present time. And, I wrote it and I just, went into it because the gift in that story also, the gift even in my relationship with Patabi Joyce and going back to Billy, that they're all angels. It doesn't condone his behavior. But I've dealt with childhood sexual trauma and sexual trauma my whole life. I've been in therapy since I was 18 years old. I suffered with anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorder as a result of my childhood sexual trauma. And one of the survival mechanisms that I had and have is dissociation, my ability to check out and not feel anything at all. And one of the things that would happen to me when I would go up against anything that was overwhelming was that I would freeze and be physically incapable of taking the next action, either physically or verbally. And so I always knew that if I was to be assaulted, it would be impossible for me to run, to fight back, to even yell, because the evidence has shown that all those parts of my physiology go into freeze mode and I can't even utter a sound. Like my throat physically shuts down.
Yeah.
So what was very empowering in the Patabi story is that when I first saw what was happening, I remember, and that was day number 1, I remember looking around and being like, is everyone else seeing this too? Because this doesn't seem right. But everyone was telling me that what I was seeing wasn't actually in reality. It was the guru doesn't have that relationship with the human body, blah, blah, blah. Or I was projecting something, misunderstanding something. And I was like, yeah, I don't think so. Because I'd already been in therapy at this point for 12 years. So I had done an enormous amount of work on learning how to speak up and out and learning how to trust that what I was seeing and experiencing was actually real. And so I was like, I'm choosing to be here because I want to be part of this experience, but this is happening. So the first time it happened to me, I went into that dissociation, meaning that I said out loud that I remember the first time it happened. I didn't write about this in the book. But the first thing that I said spontaneously was, and it was sarcastic, but it was, lovely. Just like that. So it was sarcasm, which was, kind of my passive aggressive way of like acknowledging that this thing just happened.
Totally.
But it was also shocking to me that something actually physically came out of my mouth that acknowledged it at all. And the next couple of times that it happened, I didn't say anything, but I was enraged because I knew this is not okay. It was that moment, though, when he was on my back and I can feel his penis up against my sacrum, and I could feel like this is happening and I'm trapped under the weight.
Yeah.
Where it happened so spontaneously and my hand reached out and I smacked him and yelled to stop. And then there was dialogue that went back and forth between him and Sharat, and Patabi climbed off of me. Not in English, no. And Patabi never touched me again. But literally, it was a punishment. It was an absolute punishment. He did not touch me. He would not look at me, nothing until I left. Sharat, on the other hand, went above and beyond to be a gentleman and to be focused and professional. And I don't know what his role, he was only 19 or so at that time. But
his soul knew what was going on. It's clear from the tone that he used.
Yeah. Well,
that he was reprimanding him.
When recently Sharat wrote just a few weeks before my book came out, Sharat wrote a piece online on Instagram, an apology.
Whoa.
And acknowledging what was happening. And it was such a relief because I knew that when my book came out, after what I wrote that I was going to take a big hit, especially within the Ashtanga community. And I wasn't looking forward to it, but I was prepared. And I had already at that point taken some hits from some of my senior teachers who had read the book prior, who had read the chapter prior, and were trying to desperately get me to take that out. And it was a really uncomfortable time for me because everything that I thought was going to happen was starting to happen. So when Sharat came forward and acknowledged what his grandfather did and made a public apology, and it wasn't perfect. I mean, it wasn't, but it was for someone not as a senior teacher, but someone who was actually victimized by Patabi. I immediately responded with just thank you. I didn't explain. I didn't go into it. I didn't feel the need to have to get into the whole story with the public. I figured, they'll find out soon enough. But I just responded, thank you. Because it's all I needed to hear was an acknowledgement that this happened and that once Sharat acknowledged it, no one else, all the senior teachers who were, saying that, I was a liar, there was no place for them to go except to take ownership for their own complicity and their own denial. And so it was important for me. I hope it was important it took an exhale out for some of the other women who have had this impact, had this experience and had felt vilified. I'm proud of the chapter, even though it was re-traumatizing to have to share so much about my own, not so much about Patabi, but the intricacies of the dissociation and the journey that someone who experiences sexual trauma goes through in order to come through the other side. That it's not like, well, why don't you just fight them back? Why don't you just say something? Trauma runs deep in the body, and there's some real physiological impacts that you have to work through before you can break through.
Yeah. And you spent all that time in therapy. I'm going to name him Norman. So sweet. All the ways in which you reference him in the book are so nice. I think it will help a lot of women and men who resist having a therapist. That's still happening, and see that what a benefit it is to have somebody with whom to bounce ideas and assumptions and grievances and perceptions and perhaps be introduced to another way to look.
I always say to people, like, if you have the resources, if you can afford it, or if you can have a life coach or get into the program, something. But I always tell them that if someone wants to learn to get their leg behind their head, they're going to come to someone like me or you, someone who has training, someone who has experience, someone who understands anatomy, and be able to look at their bodies and explain, well, here are the steps you have to take physically, emotionally, psychologically, in order to prepare your body to be able to move in that particular direction. Now, there's not going to be a lot of shame around it. They're going to be like, oh, I see. I've got to do ABC to get my hip open enough safely to be able to approach this. And I would say, yes, here are the exercises, here are the practices. And to me, it's the same with therapy. If you leave me to my own devices, my perception is going to be influenced by my trauma, by my fear, my rage, my shame, my guilt, my grief, and the limitations I have in my understanding of a broader worldview. So I'm going to hire someone who has that experience and that knowledge, who's going to be able to hear my perception and mindfully guide me into just a broader understanding in a timeline that my nervous system can handle. And I think that as I share in the book, Norman led me psychologically to a certain degree, to a certain place. And then my next therapist, all of them just added to it as my nervous system titrated to the information, and meaning acclimated. And so yoga was not enough alone. Yoga actually became one more tool for my dissociation, because in yoga, I learned detachment. Big feeling comes up, detach, breathe, and everything changes. But it was in therapy that said, no, what is that feeling? What is the rage, the shame? Give it a voice, give it a shape. Don't get spiritual, get human. And because yoga taught me how to bypass, where therapy taught me how to be present without shame. And And then in time, I learned how to integrate the two.
Right. It's interesting. You taught at Omega, going back to one of the earlier chapters, you taught at Omega 4 days after your father passed away.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember going to Australia and teaching like a week or two after my mom passed away and not changing the plan, taking the kid and just going. And you talk about this is like one of the most touching moments of the book for me. You talk about this porousness that you felt that when you were teaching so close to his death, you could almost feel more acutely and precisely everything that the students were feeling. And I know that to be the hugest gift ever when somebody passes close to you. Can you talk a little bit about that time? And
Yeah.
for my listener who's just lost a parent or just lost somebody close to them, what's the beauty in that time and what should we look for?
Oh, boy. Actually, the moment you're talking about wasn't in the book. So that must have been a conversation between you and I personally that like landed, or you heard me talk about it elsewhere. I do share about my father, the very last chapter, which is an ass kicker of a chapter. Hard to write, but so important. And it frames so much of the book. But the moment that you're referring to was, I really thought that, as I thought with all the skills that I have, that I would be able just to get on with it. My dad was a yoga teacher. He really helped me to walk through his death and dying. But when he died, so much got excavated. It was such a deep initiation. When I went to Omega, I remember I got out of the car with my mom and a student walked by and just said, "Hey, Seane." And I turned and like big smile just kind of lit up. "Hey, how are you?" And I turned back to my mom and my eyes filled with tears and my hands started to shake because I realized there was normally when I teach, there's a screen door between me and everyone else. There's just this natural barrier that it's just an energetic boundary. It didn't exist. I felt everything. I felt their humanity. I felt their family. I felt their loss. I felt their grief. I felt their pain and suffering or their future pain and suffering. And it went right through my body. And I was like, oh my God, Mom, I can't do this. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to stand in the presence of another soul while I'm in my grief. It was all so raw and new. And I'm emotional even thinking about it because it was so, I had to pull up the strongest, I had to suppress the most vulnerable part of myself and pull up I don't even want to use the word strong because quite frankly, I don't think it was that. It was just resiliency to be able to get through this weekend. But the most powerful thing happened because everyone knew my dad died and everyone was being really great and checking in and everything. But, it was like lights were on, but no one was home because I knew I was going to fucking crack.
Right.
And the last class, it was a women's only class and there were hundreds of people in that room. And I hadn't publicly mentioned anything about my dad. And it was the very last prayer. And I don't know where it came from within me, but I was offering a prayer. And then I said, if you would, I would love to offer, and I'd love to send out an om to and I couldn't say the word. And like, I remember my mouth tightening and starting to quiver and I couldn't say the word father. But everyone knew what was happening, what I had been holding. And all of a sudden, this one woman in the room just started to om.
Of course.
And everybody started to om. And I sat on the stage and just wept and let myself be carried by the community to do for me what I couldn't do, which was surrender and let myself feel the overwhelm of grief and also to let them witness the humanity of it. Before my dad died, he wanted me to teach this workshop called Yoga for a Broken Heart. And he wanted me to do it within 3 months of his death. And I told him, I was like, Dad, I can't do it. I'm not going to be able to talk about any of this. I have to process it. And my dad said, you have to normalize death. It's a part of the living, and you are fortunate enough to do it in the right order of things,
Mm.
meaning that even though it's hard, it's still the right order. They die before we die. We shouldn't have to bury our children, which many people sadly do. And I remember that moment of being lifted by the community and being witnessed in my grief and allowing my vulnerability and my shame, as if I should be better because I'm a teacher. I should be beyond this. I shouldn't have to, I should be like, yeah, it's okay. We walk each other home and that's what this is. That wasn't the truth. And by them carrying me, it empowered me to be able to, within those 3 months, teach yoga for a broken heart. And even though it was really hard, every time I talked about death and dying and witnessed people in their grief and let them witness me in mine, it accelerated my healing process.
Right.
And I know it accelerated others as well. And I'm not going to suggest it was easier. It just was always a relief when it was over, just to have the space to speak about the incomprehensible.
Mm.
And I remember, of course, when your mom passed also, although I remember saying to my dad that I was so grateful that he was teaching me about death and dying first before my mom, because not that I loved my father any less, but there was definitely a different love that I experienced between my father and my mother.
Right.
And my father helped me to prepare for the inevitability of my mom's, which if it was reversed, I don't know if I'd even be having this conversation with you.
It was not an easy time.
No.
That was not. But we had these 24 hours, and I got to say and feel and do a lot of the things that anyone would have ever wanted to do or say.
Yeah.
And I'd read all the books, and I'm secretly a little bit obsessed with death. And one of my main teachers is Rod Stryker, and he's always teaching so that we can have a better death, not necessarily a better life. And all of that fed into it. I spoke to Douglas Brooks that day, got a prayer, all the things that I needed to do, but it was still crazy.
Yep. And you said the perfect thing there. If you have that kind of relationship with your family, say all the things.
All the things.
I didn't want to, because it felt like if I went to my dad and started saying all the things, it would mean acknowledging that he was going to die. It would mean saying goodbye. And I didn't want to be that one to like put the nail in his coffin, so to speak. And I knew when it was happening, when we were moving, there was the cancer, it was too late. And I knew I had to be the one to go to him and say, I'm so sad and I'm so scared. I'm going to miss you so much. And here's all that I love. Oh my God, that walk from my bedroom to his was just the longest walk known. It felt like the longest walk known to man, and dropping to my knees and putting my head on his chest and letting him be my dad, letting him be my daddy, like letting him hold me and whisper in my ear and letting me sob like I was 8 years old, and letting him carry me and not being that, the strong woman that I am, or that the identity of that, surrendering it and letting him hold space for his daughter was one of the best gifts that I gave him and myself. So anyone who's listening who's walking through this, I know I can speak for you with this, is our hearts are with you on this.
Definitely.
It is hard and it is messy and it is heartbreaking, and your heart will crack open and you will experience a whole other level of humility and love and grace that only death can open us to, in the same way I imagine birth opens us to. And the grief process that first year sucked. And then it gets different. And I feel my father in my physical body in a way that I never did when he was alive. And I experience things in life that in the past I wouldn't have enjoyed or been interested in, but I know my dad would. And as long as I'm alive and breathe, I know my father is still experiencing this world. And so I my dad lives as long as I live and hold the world with curiosity. It's like, Daddy, this one's for you. And I know that he's enjoying himself through me.
Right.
And so my heart is with anyone listening right now who's just feeling into this, because it's a rough ride,
Yeah.
but we heal and we love and we forgive and we remember well, and they are truly with us always.
Thank you for that.
Oh, you just fucked me up with this
Oh,
conversation.
dude,
You fucked me up.
I've cried 3 times already. I'm playing it super cool, but I have tears streaming down my face right now. Good grief. Last thing,
Fuck.
page 210 is where I'm at right now in your book. You say, quote, do your inner work. You may need to dismantle the systems within first, balancing those fundamental forces yoga calls the gunas over and over again that keep you from truly committing to justice. Now, I've read Mindful of Race. I've interviewed Ruth King. I'm obsessed with her. We had a beautiful conversation about mobilizing collective consciousness around racial conditioning. And I had a big awakening, and my kid had a big awakening. She uses mindfulness to reprogram our nervous system, deconstruct things. Your mission has always impressed me in this regard, because somehow you get all of this justice work into the asana practice. And I would love for you to just talk a little bit, for the teacher who's listening and the student who's listening, about how that came about, what it is for you now, how it's evolved, perhaps.
I think that's the evolution that I experienced in yoga. And then this interesting hypocrisy, this moment of like hearing we're all one. And knowing that on an energetic level, of course, that's true. But looking around the world and thinking like, really? Because I seem to have a lot more access to resources and safety and peace than most people in this world.
Yeah.
And I would, so much of the context of yoga is about the eradication of suffering. And yet I was also simultaneously aware of my participation in that suffering. And I would hear teachers say things like, we can't be free unless we're all free, and that our liberation is bound. And it was so clear to me, it's about action. These are just words. Without action, these are words. And the system is designed to keep people oppressed. And I am a part of that system because I benefit from those systems that support people like me who are in the dominant culture. And I thought, oh my God, where is it then within the context of yoga that talks to this? And it certainly wasn't it's everywhere in the context of yoga. It's everywhere. It's really looking at our pride. It's looking at our ego. It's looking at all aspects of the self. Everywhere in yoga is asking us to hold the mirror up and to look at and self-study the places within ourselves that are dominated by the ego, that are creating suffering in others. And so if we want to dismantle the world that exists, that is creating oppression, then the first course of action requires us to dismantle the systems within ourselves that participate in that division of inequity.
Right.
And this became a mission of mine. I would say the practice shifted from the me to the we back in around 1997 when I went to work for Children of the Night, because I didn't go there with any sense of altruism. It wasn't about that at first. Now I look now and I see that God led me there because it was the next level of my evolution. But at the time, it was only because I was starting to make money as a yoga teacher. I believe in energy, and that abundance is an energy. And then if you stop the flow of abundance, like if you're not giving back, then you stop that flow. It becomes caustic. And I didn't want to stop the flow of abundance. So my interest in giving back, I put this in air quotes, was really cavalier. It was really about my own self-interest. And so I'm like, well, I should probably give something away then. But yet destiny led me to an environment that first held the mirror up, where I got so triggered and so uncomfortable and judgmental and reactive when I met what I would find out later was my disowned self. The part of me that I thought I had healed was standing right in front of me, and I didn't like it, and I wanted to run from it. And yet by running from it, then once again, I am a part of creating this suffering, because it was scaring me, what I was going to have to face within myself. And then it just continued to evolve, this sense of the me. At first it was helping. I'll help people. And then realizing that actually, without unpacking that, my helping is the perpetuation of white supremacy.
Right.
And it was like, son of a bitch. So now I have to unpack that. And now I have to look at power and privilege. And now I have to look at my own internalized racism. And now I have to look at, well, if I believe no separation of the mind body, then I'm holding on to the prejudice and the stereotyping and the racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, etc., of my culture, of my religion, of my grandmother and ancestry, and that lives within me too. And that's yoga teaches me then to, going back to this idea of normalizing it, we can't change it unless we can see it. So I need to normalize it and instead of saying, well, I'm not racist, say, of course I'm racist. There's no way that I can't be if I believe in the mind-body connection. So once I say, of course I am, then it allows me, in the moment when I get triggered and the internalized bias and prejudice arises, I do what yoga teaches us to do. I pause, I breathe, I get very present, and I make a different choice. So rather than be reactive, I'm responsive, and then therefore responsible. But it comes to me as a sensation. I'll feel it in my body first and be like, Seane, do not do or say a thing because you're about to create harm. Take a moment and be like, oh, hey, grandma, your bias is up right now. All right. What's the truth? Let's get underneath that. But don't pretend it's not happening. And I really wanted to get in the book. I was very committed to, instead of telling people like, you're a racist, your white supremacy is showing, I wanted to model it and be like, or rather embody it and say like, here's what it looks like. And here's how it shows up every single day. And here's how it shows up in my life, even as an experienced yoga teacher. Because by the end of the book, it's not 20 years ago, it's 5 years ago. And so it was important to say like, this is going to continue to happen. The rate in which, though, we create harm gets less and less when you have good tools that you can access in the moment of the overwhelm. And so that's what those chapters are all about. And that's what the evolution of my own practice has led me towards. It's not fun, believe me, but I prayed, and I do this in the very beginning of the book. I open my book up with a prayer, and I want people to read that prayer, because that prayer opens that portal that if you're praying for transformation and clarity, that's what you're going to get. And it often shows up in a really messy way, but it's no less a response to the prayer itself. So that's what I asked for, is I want to be in service to this world in the most integrated and whole and holy way I can. And what it looks like is accountability. And that to me is what true allyship looks like, is taking accountability for the ways in which we create suffering and then change it.
You're the one who does that. For me, when I saw you starting to do that, it was just the beginning, but I could feel you, and you moved me to weave messages into the asana in a way that nobody else had. And I really don't feel that anyone else does yet. I feel like you have a thing all your own, and the presence that you're able to cultivate in a room full of hundreds of people is priceless.
Thank you for that. Thank you. That's my commitment, and it will continue to be. And it's what I want to, that in my mentorship and in my training of young yoga leaders, is to help give them the framework to be able to do that in an organized way, to be as mindful of their languaging as possible, and to, instead of lecturing to the students, to really speak from the heart what it means to be in co-conspiracy with the community in order to create social change and justice in the name of peace. And it's not easy. it can be really, really scary, but there are skills and tools that can help the young teacher feel more confident in doing so, and also looking internally on how to process that fear so that it's not the thing that drives the message. But I'm not going to say it's easy. And I've had mentorship and training I did not do this just whimsically. I looked for guidance when I made that commitment, because like we're yoga students above anything else. And as my yoga practice was changing, so did my teaching. My teaching needed to change, and it needed to be bold, but it was scary. And I have definitely had some missteps. I've made massive mistakes, which, I don't hesitate to share in the book. But I don't regret any of them, because they helped me to ask the right questions and to find the people to help me unpack those answers with more skill.
Last two questions. Who are your main mentors at this time? And if you had to leave a young yoga leader with one thing, one bit to either avoid or amplify, those are your last two questions.
Oh, who are my main? Well, in the book I shared, Mona Miller was probably the most influential person in my life, and I worked with her for about 11 years until she passed. And she's still, through her books and her lectures, like, she's still the one who I call to in my meditations, in my prayers, and in my dreams for guidance and for support. The leaders that I'm most inspired by are the social justice leaders that exist, within Theo Drake, Jacoby Ballard, Susanna Bart. I'm not going to pronounce her last name correctly. Barkataki, thank you. Nikki Myers, Ardub. These are teachers in the communities of yoga that are committed to bridging the gap between yoga, social justice, speaking to folks on the margins. They may not have the same visibility as someone like myself, but their words, their messages, their commitment to social change and understanding the way in which it connects directly to yoga is where I get both my motivation, my inspiration, and my courage. These are often folks on the margins who have way more at risk than I do. Those are the folks who inspire me most, because if they can speak truth to power, then how dare I not? And spiritually, the teachers that I resonate with: Panditji, Rod Stryker, Sri Aurobindo, and the Mother will always be strong guides for me because of their own commitment to service and social change. Those are the spiritual teachers that still influence and guide. Matthias Ratti, who died recently, has always been a big teacher to me, as well as Eddie Modestini, and Lisa Walford. These are the teachers that I turn to when I need either physical, emotional, spiritual guidance or support. Chuck Miller has always been a dear teacher to me as well, and will continue to be going forward. Yeah, those are some of the people that I turn towards. And what I would say to a young yoga teacher: do the work. Never, ever stop doing the work. Yoga's never been for me about the rainbow. It's not all bliss and harmony and, infinite transcendence every single day. It's messy and bloody, and it can be brutal, and it can pull back the veils of illusion to reveal the sacred, which is that the messy and the bloody and the incomprehensible is equally holy to that of the bliss. And our work is to be in relationship to both, to see the sacred in both, and to honor the human experience as it is, as blessed and divine, and to develop as much empathy for your own journey as possible, because it will require that to be able to stand in the presence of another soul when they're in their shadow and hold them in holiness and in love. And so do your work, find your teachers, keep evolving, keep growing. Don't be afraid to get your ass handed to you again and again and again. Keep getting up, say you're sorry often, be humble in this process, and trust that you're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing the work you're supposed to be doing, and always stay open to the new teachers as they reveal themselves, because they will. And only when you're available to it will you be able to say yes to opening yourself to their guidance.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for everything, all the work, all the years. It's been so many years for me just watching and learning and being near, being far. Thank you so much from all of us.
Thank you. And thank you to you. Believe me, I've watched your evolution as well, and the poetry of your words and your commitment to using that space to be raw and poetic. And I've witnessed it firsthand in your classes, your ability to articulate some of the complexities of the spiritual practice in a way that lands not in someone's head, but in someone's heart via the body. And so I know you're gifted at it. And so thank you for being willing in your own practice and teaching to continually evolve, because it shows. And people like me are paying attention. So good on you too. And I encourage you to continue.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been great. I appreciate everything, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much. It was such a joy to talk to you. Truly.
Same.
Yeah.
Same. Thank you.